Hear from our next keynote speaker, Dr. Brad Wilcox, about what role public policy plays in the fatherhood movement. Dr. Wilcox is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and serves as the director of the National Marriage Project. Dr. Wilcox was a Jefferson Scholar as an undergraduate student at the University of Virginia before he earned his PhD in sociology at Princeton University. His research focuses on the quality and stability of marriage and family life in the United States and across the globe. Dr. Wilcox is the author and co-editor of 5 books and has had his research on marriage, cohabitation, parenting, and fatherhood featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, NPR, National Review, and many more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Wilcox to the stage. Dr. Wilcox.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Commissioner Carter, for having me out here. The post-lunch slot today, get us trying to wake us all up here to a very good lunch today. So I think, when it comes to fatherhood today, there are certainly voices out there in the culture that would kind of want to minimize the importance of dads, from Hollywood to the halls of academia. We can kind of get this message out there that fathers are fungible. From Jennifer Aniston saying that, quote, women are realizing it more and more when they don't have to settle with a man just to have that child. Or the Cornell psychologist, Peggy Drexler, saying, quote, women possess the innate non-power that in itself is more than sufficient to raise sons. So again, this idea that dads are fungible. But I have to confess, as I kind of think about this issue of fatherhood, that it's personal for me, because I grew up without a father in the home. And as a boy, I certainly did not think that fathers were fungible. I was keenly aware that there was no one in my backyard to throw football with, and no one to take me camping in the backwoods of New England, like many of my friends. So I was kind of left with a palpable sense of loss and longing as a child. It probably also helps to explain why I found myself as a 6-year-old hurdling my metal lunchbox across the camp dining hall one summer. So it can be hard, as I think we all appreciate in this room, growing up without your dad. At the same time, I want to acknowledge, of course, that many of us can do fine. Growing up without a dad is not a death sentence. I've done okay, gotten married, been employed for 20 years, etc. But still, as a young man, I came to the view that dads make a difference, and our world would be better if more kids had the benefit of a father in their own lives. And speaking now more as a social scientist, putting on that hat right now, it's important to sort of recognize the science of fatherhood suggests to us that there are kind of 4 ways in which dads make a difference today for their kids, in terms of things like providing, playing with their kids, challenging their kids, and disciplining their kids. And on the first front, providing, I think we tend sometimes to discount the importance of male providership in public today. But, in 2023, money still matters. From paying for food, which of course seems to get more and more expensive every day, to putting a roof over our kids' heads, to covering the costs of things like travel sports for some. Having a dad in the picture sure helps. You kind of can see on this slide how there's a connection between fatherhood and providership that plays out even today. But dads bring more than money to the table. Their sheer physicality matters as well. If you go to McGuffey Park near my house, what you will see is dads throwing up toddlers into the air to kind of squeals of delight, or dads throwing footballs or playing basketball with their kids. And as we've learned this morning from Dr. Fail, this rough and tumble play helps to kind of socialize kids. The Emory psychologist John Snary has written that, quote, children who roughhouse with their fathers quickly learn that biting, kicking, and other forms of physical violence are not acceptable. And Sneri's research, Dr. Farrell's research tells us actually that kids who have the benefit of this kind of physical play with their fathers are more likely to be flourishing, not just on the field, but off the field. There is research telling us, for instance, they're more likely to be socially popular in their classrooms when they have the benefit of more physical play with their fathers. And then challenging kids. You know, dads also excel in pushing their kids out of the metaphorical nest to kind of embrace challenges and difficulties in the outside world. The psychologist Dan Paquette has been studying this issue from a variety of different perspectives and places. And he found, for instance, in studying toddlers and parents who were learning how to swim, that is, the toddlers learning how to swim, that moms would kind of teach their toddler how to swim kind of like this. Face to face, okay, and kind of giving their toddlers in the water that sense of security, you know, in the pool. By contrast, dads would often take the toddlers and turn them around, okay, kind of do what's called Duke and Altum, sort of pointing them out into the deep. This is just kind of a pretty good way of sort of thinking about the broader pattern that he talks about and finds in his research. And as it, quote, fathers play a particularly important role in the development of children's openness to the world. They also tend to encourage children to take risks, thus permitting children to learn to be braver in unfamiliar situations, as well as to stand up for themselves. So again, this is kind of one more way in which dads can make a distinctive difference in the lives of their kids. And then finally, discipline. And of course, this is kind of an old school comment, an old school perspective, but it's still the case that dad's discipline is distinctive. Dads tend to be stronger, bigger. The tone of their voice is different as well. And these things are noticed by kids and help foster a climate of order in the home, especially with teenage boys. The Yale psychiatrist Kyle Pruitt said, quote, fathers tend to be more willing than mothers to confront their children and enforce discipline, leaving their children with the impression that they in fact have more authority. And again, Dr. Fail kind of talked about this in his own way this morning. But the point I'm just kind of getting at is that dads play an important and distinctive role in terms of how they approach discipline. And what's also, I think, important to note here too, in a sort of a spirit of full transparency, is that the Yale psychiatrist Kyle Pruitt has also kind of underlined the ways in which both paternal and maternal approaches to discipline are valuable. The kids benefit from having that less flexible parent, the father in this kind of context, but also benefit from having oftentimes a more flexible approach to discipline coming from the mom. So kind of both of these different styles can be of merit and of value to our children. So as we kind of begin to think about today and tomorrow and Wednesday, all the ways in which dads are important in the lives of Tennessee's kids and Tennessee's communities, I think we can appreciate that there are more and more voices from kind of across the political and across the ideological spectrum that are kind of lifting up the role that fathers play in the lives of their kids and in the lives of the community. And one of those voices is Richard Reeves, who was at Brookings. He started up a new institute on boys and men. And he's written a book called Of Boys and Men, which is up here on the screen to my left and right. And in that book, Reeves says, quote, fathers matter for their children's welfare in ways that are different from, but equal to those of mothers. He talks about how dads matter for kids' success in school, for their mental health, and a host of other outcomes. And he is kind of making this case clearly from the left. And I welcome his intervention from the left on behalf of American dads. But we do have a bit of a disagreement when it comes to kind of this question of fatherhood, because in his book, Reeves also suggests that marriage need not play a central role in connecting dads to their children. He says, quote, the goal then is to bolster the role of fathers as direct providers of care to their children, whether or not they are married to or even living with the mother. Now, it's important to note here, and we've kind of talked about this morning, that obviously dads can and do play important roles in their kids' lives outside of marriage. No doubt about that. But the question that I want to think about in part this afternoon is it helpful for us to understand and appreciate the ways in which marriage does tend to connect men to their kids? And if that's kind of a reality in our country and in the state, what can we do also to help strengthen not just sort of fathers in a generic way, but also marriage as an institution? And so we see when we kind of look at the data is there is, still a very strong connection in this country between fatherhood and marriage. We can see kind of from a day in and day out perspective for kids, if they're not living with their father, as this figure here suggests to us, they see their dads on average less than 1 hour a week, okay? Whereas if they're living with their fathers, you can see they're seeing their dads a lot. You can imagine that to be the case. So the point here is it's kind of residence matters and marital status matters when it comes to kind of spending time with your dad, even in kind of 21st century America. Let me kind of think too about what is sort of the difference that marriage makes for the welfare of children. And obviously one outcome we want to think about is just child poverty. Because again, as I said before, money still does matter for kids today on a variety of different levels and fronts. And we see here is that kids who are living with their married fathers, both black and white, are just much less likely to be poor in this country compared to kids who are living in single parent, primarily single mother households. So again, there's a kind of a connection between having a married father unseen and your odds of sort of facing poverty. This is true across racial and ethnic lines here in the country. And then for me, this is probably the most poignant figure. I've got a new book coming out with HarperCollins just in time for Valentine's Day on marriage. And I've got a lot of figures in that book. But this figure on the left here is the one that kind of keeps me up at night as both a scholar and as a husband and as a father of both biological and adoptive children. Because what we see here is that for our sons, for our boys in this country, if they have the benefit of their own married father in the household, their odds of graduating from college are about 4 times their odds of ending up being incarcerated, okay? So college is just much more common, for instance, than incarceration for boys who've got the benefit of a married dad in their own household, their own father in the household. By contrast, and this was pretty striking to me, pretty surprising to me when I ran the numbers, my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wong, who's here up in the front, what we can see here is that across every other family group, our young men are more likely to end up being incarcerated than they are to graduate from college, okay? So to suggest, to argue that marriage is not that important for kids, I think tends to sort of minimize or deny some important realities that, again, don't apply to every kid. I was raised, as I said, by a single mom. I was not incarcerated. I graduated from college. But we can see that there are different risks for our kids in different contexts. And marriage is part and parcel of these risks that we, I think, need to be attentive to today. Okay, so what does this mean for public policy? So I think when we think about the policies that Commissioner Carter and his colleagues are kind of sketching out with the state legislature and with the governor, we should be thinking about policies that do at least 3 things. One is kind of aim for a responsible fatherhood ethic for all dads, kind of regardless of their marital or residential status. We should aim to kind of try to strengthen marriage across the state. And then also aim to kind of serve those dads who are not living with their kids, recognizing they often have unique challenges and can use some assistance. And the point here is that kind of in more colloquial terms, we can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time on 3 different fronts. We can value all dads. We can recognize the importance of trying to strengthen marriage in the state. And actually, it's worth noting that the share of kids surprising in the state who've been born in marriage has come up a little bit in Tennessee in the last year. So this is not like always going to go in one direction. That's one side. And then also, of course, to work with dads who are living apart from their kids. We can do all 3 of those things at the same time. So in terms of the first idea that I have for kind of Tennessee, in terms of family policy ideas, we could think about responsible fatherhood in terms of PSAs that would be honoring all fathers, recognizing the importance of designing ads and other forms of media now on social media and other platforms that educate the public, that motivate men, and encourage couples to work together to keep dads in the lives of their children across the state of Tennessee. People often ask me how this research that we've been talking about all day today has shaped my own approach to fathering. And before I read the research, I did not know that dad's roughhousing was linked to kids' development. And I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to learn that I'm not the most physical kind of guy, okay? So just sort of coming across the kind of research that Dr. Farrell was talking about this morning, maybe much more intentional about kind of taking Saturday mornings and roughhousing with my kids on the family room floor. So this is a kind of, I think, helpful messaging that would be beneficial to all Tennessee dads to kind of recognize that on a variety of fronts, when it comes to money, when it comes to play, when it comes to discipline, when it comes to challenging their kids, that they can and should play an important role in lifting up their kids and serving the next generation in that way. So it's insights like this that should guide a PSA campaign across the state. And there are ways that you can kind of use the experience of Florida and obviously the federal government to kind of structure these campaigns. We know that there is a campaign called Take Time to Be a Dad today from the feds that might have some lessons for this state here in Tennessee. Okay, the second idea is to promote what's called the success sequence in Tennessee schools and also kind of in some online or PSA contexts. The success sequence is this idea that if you get at least a high school degree first, and then work full-time early in your 20s, and then get married before having children, your odds as a young adult of being poor are just 3% in your late 20s and your 30s. And we see in this research too that African Americans, Hispanics, whites, Asians, upper income, middle income, lower income young adults who follow the sequence are just much less likely to be poor as they hit their late 20s and 30s. So it kind of applies across the board. And so the idea here is you could kind of incorporate the success sequence as a kind of a messaging campaign, both for PSA platforms, but also kind of incorporate into the school curricula across the state for high schoolers as well. And we see in some polling that we have done is that more than 70% of all Tennesseans would support the idea of public schools across the state incorporating the success sequence into the kind of information that young adults are getting here in the volunteer state. But again, the point would be to kind of teach them in concrete ways how education, work, and marriage are all linked to and conducive to flourishing financially. And I think no one kind of would disagree probably in this room about sort of the value of education. Probably no one would really disagree about the value of work. We might have some disagreement about sort of the importance of marriage per se, but it's important beyond our particular disagreements on this issue to recognize that for our young adults today, we're seeing kind of an erosion, particularly among young men, of their commitment to an engagement with full-time work, and then also, of course, marriage. So this is where I think the success sequence could be helpfully integrated both into public school curricula and then also into some kind of public campaign across the state. When I say like a campaign, I'm thinking of videos like this one. I'm gonna see if I can get this going here just for a few seconds. Is the volume?
In the United States are unplanned, unintended.
We know that it's better at the front end of a relationship to take things slowly in terms of both sort of sex and the emotional connection to someone. A lot of young adults are moving quickly into sex, cohabitation, and parenthood. They haven't really figured out if they're a good fit for one another.
being a father so early kind of threw me into this sink or swim situation. Everything that I was involved in at that point was almost like playing catch up because I had this kid I wasn't ready for. I was a teenager. Storms sometimes do sneak up on you, lightning storms. You just have to deal with what you have right then and there.
Right now, we have a lot of drifting into parenthood. Almost half of all pregnancies in the United States are unplanned, unintended.
We know that it's better at the front end of a relationship to take.
Okay, so you heard that before, but the point is we could kind of use PSAs in this kind of spirit to educate our young adults, including our young men, about the challenges of moving too quickly into relationships and into parenthood without being kind of adequately prepared as part and parcel of a larger kind of curriculum or campaign around the success sequence. So the third thing that I would suggest too that the state does is to think about making the schools across Tennessee more boy-friendly. And this is, again, it's kind of in the spirit of Dr. Farrell's commentary this morning. But I think thinking about kind of giving more public schools a kind of single-sex option. I mean, what we do know is that there are some fantastic private schools, not even a couple of miles from here, that are single-sex, but they've got pretty hefty, price tags. Can we make more public schools accessible across the state on a single-sex basis to kind of help serve the unique educational needs of boys across Tennessee, or even have single-sex classes doing that as well would be kind of one thought. A second idea is to think about reforms for kind of all public schools, so kind of give boys more recess time, for instance, but also bring more male teachers into the classroom. We know that boys are more responsive to male teachers, and that would help kind of bridge this gender divide that we've seen growing for boys in schools across the US and across Tennessee. And the third point here, idea is to have more high quality vocational education that is preparing young adults, particularly young males, for all of the wonderful kind of manufacturing and other kind of commercial opportunities that have emerged in Tennessee in recent years. A fourth idea is to incorporate a host of responsible fatherhood programs that are aimed at non-residential dads. I'm thinking here of the fact that more than a quarter of Tennessee children are being raised in single mother households. It's a bit higher than the national average. And we could have, I think, more programs that are kind of targeting many of sort of the dads in their lives and using programs like First Things First in Chattanooga, Tennessee as models here. I know, for instance, of a man named Andre who was involved with First Things First in 2018 through their Dads Making a Difference program. At that point, Andre found himself behind on child support with a daughter, and he was having some conflict with the daughter's mother. And he was also married to a new woman, Milana, with whom he had 2 kids, and he was struggling in that relationship. But First Things First gave him kind of the skills to navigate child support with the first mom and to sort of strengthen his marriage with Milana. And because of that, he was able to kind of get on track with child support and strengthen his marriage. And had he not succeeded in doing these things, probably the state would have had to have about $30,000 a year between child support, housing issues, and other things that would have come out of kind of a broken relationship otherwise. This is kind of an example of where programs across the state can play an important role in helping non-resident dads build strong relationships both with their children, but also with the mothers and spouses and girlfriends in their life. So in this spirit, Tennessee should fund responsible fatherhood programs that include things like mentorship, one-on-one support, and helping men deal with their kids and the mothers of their children more successfully. And also do this in a spirit where they're kind of being evaluated for the success to make sure that they're kind of offering the taxpayer a good ROI. And the final thing here is a commission on boys and men. This is also, Dr. Farrell and I did not plan our talks, but we've kind of settled on some common ideas here. We did a survey on this topic with Tennessee adults and found that more than 80% of Tennessee adults would support a commission of this kind. And it would be charged with things like trying to figure out how to bridge the gender gap in Tennessee, with how to kind of counter the more misogynistic masculinity messages we're getting now online with people like Andrew Tate. And then also kind of thinking creatively about ideas to prepare Tennessee young men for a future that would incorporate for most of them, both marriage, hopefully, and fatherhood as well. So as you probably know, Tennessee is now one of the top 3 destinations in America for families with kids kind of looking to settle, in a new state. And so kind of given your newfound status as kind of as a magnet for families, it's a destination for families, I would just like to kind of conclude by encouraging you in this effort to create a new fatherhood program, and just kind of more broadly to think about a range of policies that would strengthen families across the state and kind of reinforce the leadership that you're now kind of, offering the country when it comes to making the state a place where families are flourishing and where dads are not seen as fungible, but rather as fundamental. Thank you.